Good morning, I'm Taylor Wilson, and today is Monday, June 30th, 2025. This is USA Today's The Excerpt. Today, what to know as the Senate votes on Trump's legislative priorities, plus how Trump budget cuts force mentally ill detained immigrants to fight in solitude, and some workers call out a double standard over returns to the office. The Senate begins voting this morning on President Donald Trump's package of legislative priorities as Republicans try to thread the needle for tax cuts, Medicaid reforms, and border security funding with a narrow majority. Senators spent their Sunday debating the bill before work on what is expected to be dozens of amendments. If the Senate approves the bill, the House will begin voting on it on Wednesday. Trump has asked Congress to send him the bill by Friday, July 4th. The legislation cleared a key hurdle to end the week, receiving a tight 51-49 vote in the Senate that took more than 3.5 hours, while a handful of Republicans negotiated with Senate leaders, Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance. But that wasn't the final passage the bill needs to head to Trump's desk. Instead, after the vote, Democratic Minority Leader Chuck Schumer forced Senate clerks to read the entire 940-page bill instead of customarily waiving that task. You can read more about what to expect this week with a link in today's show notes. Mentally ill detainees facing deportation are by law afforded a fair hearing, but a national program to provide attorneys has been gutted. I spoke with USA Today investigative reporter Nick Penzenstadler for more. Thanks for joining me, Nick.
Thanks for having me, Taylor.
So just starting here, Nick, the Trump administration canceled an annual contract this spring dealing with private attorneys and detainees deemed mentally or cognitively incompetent and unable to represent themselves. Let's just go back to that move. What exactly did the administration decide here?
So back in January, remember there was this flurry of executive orders, and some of those were aimed at immigration and trying to deliver on this promise of mass deportations. So there were all these advocates that were really worried that this program was for sure on the chopping block, and it was about paying private attorneys to help represent these mentally incompetent individuals. And it wasn't until April that final notice came down, and it basically killed this program nationwide, with the exception of a few states that still have it.
You keep migrants anonymous here for the most part, but one that you name in the story is Grayville Paz Cartagena. What can you tell us about his story and how this administration decision has impacted him since?
We met this individual through his attorney, his former attorney, who's no longer represented him. So he's a 31-year-old Honduran immigrant who was living in Colorado. He was undocumented and had a police encounter and then has been in ICE detention for years. And he's facing removal, but he's also been deemed mentally incompetent. And for those years, he was fighting alone until an attorney was finally referred to him, and that was helping him understand this process and get his case together until April, when this rug was pulled out and he is now without representation.
And did you hear other similar stories in reporting this piece? And just in general, do we have any number, I guess, Nick, on how many immigrants like this in detention that we know about?
Yeah, we should say that there's this group of attorneys who have sued in federal court to try to stop this action and restore the funding. Through that suit and the declarations that have been filed from the government, we know there are almost 300 mentally incompetent detainees that are in this program that are at risk or already have lost their attorneys. We also interviewed a grandmother who is in detention, who didn't want to use her name for fear of impacting her case, but she's been in the country since 1979 and is now facing removal. But she also has struggled for years with her mental health. And, you know, when she's medicated on therapy, she's has good days. And then when she's sick, she has these really, really tough days. And she says she needs an attorney to help her understand this process and give her a fair shot. And that's another thing to remember is at the bottom of all this, there is a right for these individuals to have a fair hearing, and they're supposed to be able to present evidence and examine witnesses. But of course, that becomes really difficult when you're facing these mental health challenges.
Earlier, you mentioned this lawsuit. Nick, just really what is the latest in court in terms of how some are pushing back on this?
So the attorneys that lost the contract and all of their subcontractors have filed a court action to try to stop it. That's still pending. And the government has responded by basically saying, this is not a program that we shut down. This is not an entitlement. This was just a simple contract that we have decided we are no longer going to have. We cut the money, and these individuals are free to go find other attorneys. And the attorneys are also free to continue working for free. We also had many attorneys tell us, and this is also in the lawsuit, that this is really an ethical bind.
As you write here in the piece, Nick, mentally incompetent detainees in several states are still offered attorneys. Which states are those, and how or why is that?
Yeah, this is an interesting twist. This is because of a Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruling. And of course, the Ninth Circuit's several states, but there are only detention centers in Arizona, California, and Washington that have these courts. So if you're mentally incompetent and detained in those states, you can still have a government funded attorney. Otherwise, you are at risk of losing one. And the nationwide program has been wiped out while these hundreds of other people are still represented.
I think this story is going to strike a lot of listeners and readers as pretty disturbing. Nick, what is the DOJ perspective or response amid this conversation?
Well, like I said, the DOJ has basically said this was a contract that was cut for budget reasons and they label it for convenience. And they say that these individuals are free to represent themselves. They're free to hire their own private attorneys or find pro bono attorneys to work for them. But the government's going to not continue to fund these.
Another great investigative piece from you, Nick. Nick Penzenstadler is an investigative reporter with USA Today. Thank you, Nick.
Thanks, Taylor.
Canada scrapped its digital services tax targeting U.S. technology firms late yesterday. The move came hours before it was due to take effect. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and President Donald Trump will resume trade negotiations in order to agree on a deal by July 21st, according to Canada's finance ministry. Trump abruptly called off trade talks on Friday over the tax targeting U.S. technology firms, calling it a blatant attack. He had reiterated yesterday pledges to set a new tariff rate on Canadian goods within the next week. A sniper in Idaho started a blaze and fatally shot 2 responding firefighters in an ambush attack before being found dead hours later, authorities said. A third firefighter was also shot but underwent surgery and is in stable condition. As investigators search for the shooter's motive, firefighters have resumed battling the blaze, which had grown to 20 acres by late last night. You can stay with this developing story on usatoday.com. With some employees cracking down on how often people can work from home, office workers are calling out what they say is a double standard. I spoke with USA Today senior reporter Jessica Gwynn to learn more. Thanks as always for joining me, Jessica.
Hi, Taylor. Thanks for having me.
So, we're seeing something of a crackdown on return to work at some companies. And you're right here, Jessica, about a kind of double standard that some workers are calling out. What are they criticizing and what are some examples here?
Well, during the pandemic, offices shut down and workers logged in from home, many of them for the first time. And they discovered the benefits of remote work. They could better balance their lives. They were often just as productive, if not more productive. But in recent months, some companies have begun rolling back these remote work policies. Most are going with a hybrid model, meaning you work in the office a few days a week. But some are instituting new rules requiring employees to show up in the office 5 days a week. And as you can imagine, some people aren't very happy about this. But what's gotten them really mad is that this new requirement does not appear to apply equally to everyone. They say there are executives in these companies who preach the benefits of their teams being in the office, who are often not in the office themselves. And while it's unusual, there are even some C suite executives who have cut deals to work from home, meaning they're not in the home office, they are in their own home office. For example, the new Starbucks CEO commutes on the company jet from his Newport Beach, California home to the Seattle headquarters, where employees are mostly required to be in the office 3 days a week. The Boeing CFO works in a small office in Connecticut, hundreds of miles from the company's Arlington, Virginia headquarters, where employees are often expected to be in the office full time.
Well, and as workers are being pushed back to the office in many cases, Jessica, these pandemic forced work from home arrangements can have really all kinds of benefits for both the worker and the company. Is that right?
Well, work from home can have downsides. Employers worry about a loss of collaboration, camaraderie, culture, innovation. But these arrangements can also save companies lots of money, and some studies show that they can actually increase productivity. For workers, the flexibility also can pay huge dividends. They get to ditch long, stressful commutes. They can better balance their lives. They can set up working conditions that are more conducive to getting their work done. And these arrangements have also meant more job opportunities and employment for working parents and people with disabilities. For example, a 1 percentage point increase in working from home increases full time employment by 1% for individuals with a physical disability. And that's according to new research from Stanford economics professor Nick Bloom.
Jessica, how do some of these executives defend these practices that they might get to have this kind of unique work from home arrangement while their employees are back at the office?
On this point, executives and management experts agree. While it may seem like special treatment, and it is, it's also not quite the same. Top executives spend a lot of their lives living out of suitcases and a lot less face time in the office. For example, Brian Niccol, the Starbucks CEO, is in the midst of a massive turnaround effort for a global company. So that requires him to be on the road much of the time. Starbucks says he also maintains an office and a home in the Seattle area. And ultimately, whether these arrangements are worth the money companies spend on them is up to their boards of directors.
Well, not all business leaders see the wisdom in return to office mandates necessarily, or even hybrid work arrangements, as you write. What are some of the exceptions that you outline in this piece?
Well, some CEOs were won over by work from home during the pandemic. Drew Houston, the CEO of Dropbox, for example, has a virtual first policy. He says it just doesn't make sense to force employees to show up in the office to do the same work they would do remotely. And Brian Chesky, who runs Airbnb, has a similar philosophy. In 2022, his company instituted a live and work anywhere remote work policy, which allows employees to work from home as long as they, regularly meet up in person. He says there are just better ways to make sure your employees are productive than making them show up in the office.
Another great piece from you, Jessica. Jessica Gwynn is a senior reporter with USA Today. Folks can find the full version in today's show notes. Thank you, Jessica.
Thanks for having me, Taylor.
Thanks for listening to The Excerpt. You can get the podcast wherever you get your audio. And if you're on a smart speaker, just ask for The Excerpt. I'm Taylor Wilson, and I'll be back tomorrow with more of The Excerpt from USA Today.